Good morning, class. Welcome back. We have a lot to get through in today's lesson, so let's jump straight in. As you all know, by today, you are required to have read Peter Ackroyd's 1994 historical fiction novel, Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem. Peter Ackroyd is an English novelist, well versed in exploring English history through both biographies and novels. Firstly, what do we think Ackroyd is trying to say about the nature of history itself, specifically in Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem? Any ideas? Yes, Siobhan, what are your thoughts?
Well, through manipulating conventions of historical fiction, I think Ackroyd exposes a postmodern conviction that all history is subjective.
That's an extremely valid point, Siobhan. So basically, you're saying Ackroyd is making the point that no history, or no one's version of the truth rather, can ever be absolute. Wonderful. Let's unpack the idea. What is one way you think Ackroyd is making that statement?
Through the use of real and fictive characters, we are constantly deducing whether the information we receive throughout the novel is real or fictional, and thus questioning the idea of whether the historic events we are receiving are real or fictional.
So you're saying that Ackroyd's decision to explore the prevalence of gory serial murder in Victorian London, echoing the real-life horror of Jack the Ripper, in the genre of historical fiction immediately leads us to question the truth of what we are reading?
Well, yes, but not only his use of the genre of historical fiction in general, as opposed to a biography, but specifically the fact that in Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem, he features a range of real historical figures in a fictional setting, creating a juxtaposition between fact with fiction. This forces us as readers to search for the truth, which we know is never absolute, due to the genre of the writing itself. Ackroyd's intertextual referencing of allusions gives credibility to both fictional and non-fictional characters, ultimately leading the fictional characters such as John and Elizabeth Crete to carry out the story, whilst exposing the postmodern conviction of history's subjectivity, through also featuring real historians such as Thomas de Quincey, Karl Marx, and Dan Leno. Thomas de Quincey's essay piece, On Murder is Considered as One of the Fine Arts, is mentioned and referred back to several times, particularly John Cree's fascination with it, and the brutal real-life Ratcliffe Highway murders by serial killer John Williams. De Quincey was born in 1785, died in 1859, and author of The Infection of Thomas de Quincey, A Psychopathology of Imperialism, by John Barrell, studied de Quincey's works and states how he remains a writer for the Romantic period, where his works are considered to contain context on his concern for the British in general. Written in the reign of Victoria, De Quincey's On Murder Considered as One of the Fine Arts is represented by a talk given to a gentleman's club society, which explores John Williams' brutal murders carried out in London's East End in 1811, according to Campaign magazine book reviewer Giles Hedger, but also ultimately concerns the aesthetic appreciation of murder. Through referencing this particular piece, Ackroyd is able to ultimately connect his fictional character of John Crete to that of De Quincey's real-life examination of John Williams, as seen on page 36. It is true that De Quincey, like certain other essayists from the early part of this century, could on occasion introduce passages of levity into the most serious arguments. There are moments in his essay where he excessively glamorizes the short career of the murderer John Williams, and seems somewhat unsympathetic to the suffering of that man's unfortunate victims.
It is interesting to note how Ackroyd draws attention to that last line especially, with the sibilants, that repeated S sound of seems somewhat unsympathetic, suffering, and victims, highlighting the romanticism of murder, perhaps, being the greatest issue of society at that time.
Yes, exactly. The diary entries written by who we believe to be John Crete suggest this same idea, where the brutal murders are influenced and spoken about in the same way as De Quincey's essay, almost being glamorized and romanticized and ultimately showing appreciation for murder. Why should I lavish all my genius upon those who are unworthy of it, when to exterminate a fine scholar would be so easily within my power? Think of the glory in destroying a brilliant man.
That quote is especially important as he indirectly likens Marx to a vermin with the use of the word exterminate, showing how his attention is consumed by the process of murder and placing no value in human life whatsoever.
Yes, Ackroyd's intertextualization of real characters in that Karl Marx is especially significant. Marx was a German scholar born 1818 to 1883 and documented within the Stanford Encyclopedia as being largely known for his historical process as proceeding through a series of modes of production which were characterized by class struggle, ultimately culminating in communism. Marx was used as a fictional character in Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem and is significant because his ideals of murder relate directly to that of 19th century London. Murder is part of history, you see. It is not outside of history. It is a symptom, not the cause of a great disease. He says this on page 93. Here we are receiving Marx's idea of how crime is ultimately the cause of the living conditions and situations people are in, representing how the living conditions in the 1800s ultimately resulted in crime. This is represented further through his interpretation of Victorian London on page 92. But do you see how this murder strikes at the very symbols of the city? The Jew and the whore are the scapegoats in the desert of London, and they must be ritually butchered to appease some terrible god. Do you understand that? Although London in the 1800s grew wealthy as Britain's holdings expanded, 19th century London was also a city of poverty. There was also obvious divide between religious beliefs where being Jewish or a prostitute was still considered a scapegoat. There, Ackroyd just demonstrates the idea that the specifics of history are never absolute by blending fictional and real historical identities and inserting intertextual and historiographic references.
Great evidence to support that idea, Siobhan. So thus far, we've established the idea that Ackroyd's exploration of culture in Victorian London through the genre of historical fiction exposes the postmodern conviction that all history is subjective. Firstly, accomplishing this, as Siobhan has stated, through his juxtaposition of both fictitious and real people and intertextual references which initially position us to search for the truth between the fiction. Can anyone identify another aspect of the book that builds on this idea?
Well, after you realise the initial blend of truth and fiction, I noticed how difficult it also was to find the truth, as we are given multiple accounts from multiple perspectives and in many different discourses. This process is documented by Thomas de Quincey's 1845 essay, Palimpsest of the Human Brain. The term palimpsest derives from the ancient process of erasing or writing over old written documents with new writings. But in the case of Dan Leno, Ackroyd's layering of opposing accounts creates a palimpsest that reinforces the postmodern idea that history is never absolute. It's always subjective. And how could it be absolute, when the change of writing tense, style, and form in every chapter reminds the reader how history is constantly being communicated over the top of previous accounts, lending further clarity or indeed a completely alternative history?
I'll interrupt you for a second there, Chloe. That is a great observation, in line with Peter Cholomsky's 2010 essay on Peter Ackroyd's writings, where he talks about Ackroyd's repeated destabilization of the normative reader-writer relationship in his novels, stating that Ackroyd deliberately gives us false clues and mixing the rational and irrational in the course of the investigations. This means that as a reader, we grow very distrustful throughout the novel on what information to trust and which perspective or person is delivering us the truth of the Limehouse murders. So, Chloe, give us some details on these varied discourses we see throughout the novel.
Yeah, so we are first exposed to an omniscient narrator in Chapter 1, detailing the story's conclusion, which is the eventual hanging of the fictional Elizabeth Cree. Directly following that, though, is a chapter in the form of a newspaper article discussing the entirety of the Limehouse murders, the mystery of the supposed Limehouse Golem, and criticism regarding the investigation of the case. Following this is a chapter in the form of a short dialogic extract from the trial of Elizabeth Cree, and arriving in Chapter 4 with the first-person narration of Elizabeth Cree, beginning her story from the death of her mother. We, as the readers, are just getting used to this storytelling form, just as the chapter ends and Elizabeth's story is continued, but back from the perspective of an omniscient narrator. It continues like this throughout the book, chopping and changing the discourse so that we never quite get comfortable with one version of events. Chapter 7, page 24, is the first time we are given extracts from the diary of the murderer, revealed to us in an accompanying notice that these are the extracts taken from the diary of Mr. John Cree, which is documented as now being preserved in the manuscript department of the British Museum. Ackroyd even goes so far as to provide a call mark for the supposed diary. In effect, he is very heavily leading the readers to now search for the truth of John Cree as the horrible Limehouse Golem, which we do until the deception of the diaries is revealed. Throughout the novel, we are exposed to a variety of other perspectives, layered upon accounts given by the Crees to challenge the reliability of history as it's presented to us. As Siobhan discussed, the inclusion of historical figures such as Karl Marx and George Gissing provides an element of historical accuracy, contrasting with the other narratives. At the introduction of George Gissing, he is reading his own critique of Thomas de Quincey's heavily referenced essay, responsible for inspiring a series of murders by sensationalizing violence. This in itself is a palimpsest. Inevitably, Marx and Gissing are drawn into the investigation of the Limehouse Golem as suspects. Marx, convinced that the murders were symbolic actions of anti-Semitism, claims it was the Jew who has been killed, rejecting the notion that the attacks were personal to the victim, but rather for what he represented. Conversely, Gissing, inside his cell, theorizes perhaps Charles Babbage's creation was the true Limehouse Golem, draining away the life and spirit of those who approached it. Despite being two of the only non-fictional characters, their accounts of these events are not infallible, as they are conflicting and grounded in opinions. Marx's informed by his identity and experience as a German Jew, and Gissing's by his obsession with the analytical engine. It is through the palimpsest created by the layering of these perspectives that exposes the subjective nature of history.
Excellent, Chloe. That's a perfect encapsulation of the idea that history is always a narrative recreation from the perspective of the person telling the story. So Ackroyd's Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem is teaching us not only to disseminate truth between fiction, but also to consider the presentation of history as it is always marred by the perspective in which it is being told. Do we think there are any other manipulations of writing conventions that Ackroyd is employing to force us as readers to be wary of the facts presented to us?
Well, it's got to be the reveal of the unreliable narrator that led me to the idea that no one story is to be believed. See, within the novel, there are many entries made by the supposed Limehouse Golem detailing the murders committed throughout the text. The audience is led to believe that these entries are the work of John Cree, but it's later revealed that Elizabeth is the one responsible. As is discussed by Michael D. Thomas in his 2002 article titled A Frustrated Search for the Truth, the Unreliable Narrator and the Unresolved Puzzle in Seeler's La Comina. It is the purpose of an unreliable narrator to propagate misinformation. They disclose an inner reality that ignores external truth, delivering a fragmented narrative perforated with twisted facts that blur the audience's perception and understanding. And this is a fact similarly true of factual historical accounts. See, Ackroyd's character, Elizabeth Cree, is undoubtedly an unreliable narrator. Even in the chapters presented from her perspective, holes begin to appear throughout her narrative as soon as she's introduced, and it becomes clear to the audience that she's withholding some kind of information. For example, on page 13, after suffering an episode of abuse at the hands of her mother, Elizabeth tells the audience that her mother began to sicken after that. See, not only is this coincidental, but similar occurrences become a recurring theme surrounding Elizabeth's character. Victor, who harasses her, is found dead 2 streets away, his neck broken, and Doris, who discovers her secret cross-dressing, dies 3 weeks later of drink. The audience can sense something is being withheld, but since they are not offered any further explanation, they are forced to accept these events as fact. Elizabeth's reality becomes reality. As Rayan Bell points out in his 2019 analysis of Duplicitous Detection, Ackroyd manages to comply with all the expectations of the historical fiction genre while at the same time subverting them in an almost postmodern parody. As noted by Brett Grubis in his work on historical fiction and postmodernism, the whole book is a performance. It's a meta-commentary on the genre and the cliches it draws upon, and Elizabeth Cree, the unreliable narrator, is Ackroyd's leading actress. He even makes this explicit on page 281 during the last chapter, when the character of Oscar Wilde states that the truth is independent of facts always, inventing or selecting them at pleasure. The true dramatist shows us life under the conditions of art, not art in the form of life.
Ackroyd's personification of truth in that quote, giving it the ability to invent or select facts, is a powerful comment upon the nature of history also, drawing attention once again to the point we are exploring as well. History is largely dependent on the perspective of those telling.
Yes, exactly. It's as though the audience should have suspected or even anticipated Elizabeth's deception all along. Crime fiction has undergone many changes throughout the centuries, but the unreliable narrator continues to reappear as an almost foundational characteristic of the genre. From Poe's The Telltale Heart to Hawkins' The Girl on the Train, it's almost expected of a crime novel to feature an unreliable narrator, and Ackroyd uses this to its full advantage, therefore manipulating his work of historical fiction to create a hybrid of both historical and crime conventions. There is an undeniable level of trust built between a first-person narrator and their audience, and Ackroyd uses his narrator to exploit this and emphasize his point. Just because someone tells you what happened doesn't mean you know what happened. Elizabeth, in one of her final monologues, states that no one in the audience had managed to guess it, you see, and so it comes as rather a surprise to them. The female Sirio puts on her male clothes and fools them all. First there was my dear mother, then came Doris, who saw me, there was Uncle, little Victor, the Jew, and the whores of Limehouse. The unreliable narrator is officially revealed. This passage could almost be viewed as meta-writing, a direct address to the reader. We are the audience, and Elizabeth Cree has been performing for us. Elizabeth is the murderer, and the audience becomes aware that it has been deceived by its primary source of information. When the deception is revealed, the audience is forced to reevaluate a perception of events they have nurtured throughout the entire book, and in doing so, the intent behind Ackroyd's unreliable narrator becomes clear. History is subjective, and perspective is everything.
Indeed, it seems Ackroyd is saying to us, with his final reveal, that we will never be able to discover precisely what happened either on the Ratcliffe Highway or in the Cree's household. What's more important is to reflect on societal structures that create the fascination and desire that propagates these instances of horrific murder. Through manipulating conventions of historical fiction, Ackroyd exposes the postmodern conviction that all history is subjective. Through featuring real historical figures along with fictive characters, through utilizing a variety of perspectives and discourses to reveal the palimpsestic nature of history and destroy the trust of readers through the inclusion of an unreliable narrator that challenges the objectivity of all we know of history. In the end, all history is subjective. Thank you so much for your participation today, girls. An excellent analysis of the underlying messages of Ackroyd's Dan Leno and the Limehouse Golem. Remember to keep up with your readings for next week. We're taking a look at the first part of Primo Levi's memoir, If This Is a Man. See you then.